Listen, eggs are not dairy. I can't tell you how many people ask me if eggs are dairy when I'm doing DNA consulting calls. So let's just start by saying eggs do not come from cow's milk. Cow's milk products are dairy. Okay. Now I did a video 8 years ago when I published estrogeneration, and I showed this study about estrogen increases from drinking commercial milk produced from pregnant cows. So all they tested was up to 2 hours after intake. But get this, after the intake of cow milk, serum estrogen concentration significantly increased. Okay, their estrogen went up. Testosterone significantly decreased in men. How much? 16.6% decrease in testosterone. The problem is modern farms are incentivized to push for the highest possible yields rather than the healthiest product, because it's all mixed and mass produced at most commercial dairies. So farmers continue to get cows pregnant to keep the cows lactating. They milk them while they are pregnant, which is crazy because a cow's estrogen will rise 100-fold during pregnancy. And then the dairy farms mix in all that high hormone dairy with the rest of the dairy. Next, they sell the milk in plastic containers, and you know what I think about liquid stored in plastics. So I was and still am critical of the process of dairy production rather than the dairy itself. Today, though, I want to talk entirely about the dairy itself, not focusing on the process, although I hope farmers are working to fix these same issues I noted 8 years ago. So I want to point out first, this is not an anti-dairy vegan propaganda piece. This is also not an industry-funded pro-dairy propaganda piece. This is my honest look at the science of dairy, the cons and the pros, both, but we'll start with the cons first, and then we'll go to the pros. And I'm also going to emphasize the unique individual differences, the genetic differences that different people have in terms of their dairy genes, which is the part that confuses most people when the topic of dairy comes up. Because it's human nature to want to lump everyone together and say dairy is good or dairy is bad, and people often ignore genetic differences, which needs to be included when you talk about dairy. And finally, we'll end all of this by talking about raw dairy, which is an important hot button topic. So let's start with the cons, because there are absolutely some people out there that have issues with dairy on a number of different levels. So first of all, good or bad, dairy is literally addictive. We'll talk later about all the types of proteins in cow dairy that can cause inflammation in certain people. But first of all, approximately 80% of cow dairy is casein. Casein is not a minor component in cow dairy, it's a major component. It's most of the protein in cow dairy. And casein is high in cheese, it's high in yogurt, it's high in milk, and it can make you high. During the digestion of the milk protein casein, it gets converted to casomorphine, which is an opiate, an opioid binding peptide, a protein fragment that binds your opioid receptors. Same as heroin, same as morphine. So obviously it's addictive, and it's also a troublemaker because it numbs pain. So if you have gut issues from dairy, you often don't feel them, as much as you should at least. So you underestimate the health problems that arise from these gut issues. This is similar to gluten, by the way, the other major opioid food peptide. That one is called gluteomorphine, which again is an opioid formed during the digestion of gluten. This is why bread and cheese is one of the most addictive food combinations, at least for people prone to opioid addictions. These substances are addictive. In fact, casomorphine is considered a more potent opioid than morphine itself. So in terms of addiction, it's somewhere between morphine and heroin. So obviously, if you have excess weight and you struggle to lose it, I'd suggest cutting out all the dairy products, simply because they drive you to overeat. They drive food addictions. I'm not even talking about food sensitivities here yet. We'll go into those details later. I'm just talking about the risk for comfort food cravings and giving in to temptation. If you're not overweight, you can ignore this first point, but if you're struggling in the weight department, dairy is not doing you any favors. It's an opiate. And both gluten and dairy opioids have epigenetic consequences, meaning they can cause multi-generational impacts, because the definition of epigenetics are changes that are passed on to future generations. These are physical marks on your DNA that can get inherited. You can amplify food addictions in subsequent generations, which is a poor inheritance to give future generations. It also says in this study that these wheat and milk-derived opioid peptides may predispose susceptible individuals, again, we'll talk about genetic differences later, susceptible individuals to inflammation and systemic oxidation. These are the opposite of antioxidants, partly explaining the benefits of gluten-free and casein-free diets. So the stakes are high. And I'm emphasizing the susceptible individuals here because these scientists are correctly accounting for genetic variation in how people handle dairy, which again, we'll talk about shortly. Okay, so that's casein. It's addictive, but meanwhile it stimulates mucus secretion in our gut, which can be beneficial in small amounts, but this mucus can also be an indicator of inflammation. In fact, when I used to do autopsies at Boston University Medical School, we once had someone die of a car accident or something sudden, and they were taking casein protein powder as a supplement, and they had dairy sensitivity issues, and I actually found a ball of mucus in their stomach because their body was protecting them from this huge hit of dairy inflammation by coating the casein protein powder with mucus. Meanwhile, they had probably been told casein protein powder was a good thing because a certified sports nutritionist told them casein is one of the best proteins they could take. It boosts muscle growth overnight and it's slow digesting. Yeah, it's slow digesting because it's coated in mucus. It's slowly releasing all night. Your body's trying to protect you from being blasted by inflammation when you are sensitive like that. Anyway, besides casein, dairy has a lot of proteins. Scientists have done an excellent study on the proteome of dairy, investigating Holstein cows and Jersey cows, and they used liquid chromatography and mass spectroscopy, very standard methods you would use if you wanted to identify all the different proteins in blood or in anything, milk in this case. And they found a total of 935 different proteins, with 43 proteins present at significantly different abundance between the types of cows. But the main number here is the 935. Let's round this up and say the scientists basically discovered cow milk has 1,000 different proteins. That's a lot. So casein and whey are super well studied because they're the major milk proteins in cow dairy. But that's ignoring 935 minus 2, so 933 other different proteins that might cause issues for people with dairy sensitivities. And these 933 proteins are basically not studied at all, so I don't have much to say about them specifically, other than it's a black box and they might cause inflammation. And some proteins act at very low doses to have a massive effect on our health in positive or negative ways. So this study asks more questions than it answers about the 933 dairy proteins, but I don't have much to say here on it. What I do have a lot to say about are the sugars that are stuck to the proteins. But before we leave the topic of proteins, it's important to mention many people these days eat far too many carbs. Actually, let's say most people are eating way too many carbs. So more protein in food gets professional dietitians excited. But keep this in mind. Latrotoxin, the neurotoxin from black widow spider venom, latrotoxin is a protein. So just because something is full of protein doesn't automatically make it good for you. It might be harmful. It might be amazing. Obviously, cows aren't trying to poison their calves with poisonous proteins. So it doesn't seem like the milk would be inflammatory. But cow milk is also not created for humans. It's being generated for baby cows, calves. Here's the thing. We all come from dramatically different ancestral tribes. Before airplanes existed and cars and roads, people mostly lived in tight-knit tribal groups, probably for generations upon generations upon generations. Some of them raised cows and milked the cows and drank the milk, and some of these tribes clearly did not raise cows, nor did they drink cow milk. This is called genetic divergence. There was a fork in the road. Some people went right, some people went left. The Tsimane tribe from the remote jungles of Bolivia are an excellent dairy-free example. They went left. They did not raise cows, nor do they drink milk historically, and even today, they still live together without cars, roads, or modern technologies. It's a unique situation because we can study this tribe. In fact, Michael Easter wrote a best-selling book about this tribe called Scarcity Brain. and he visited the Tsimane tribe for his research. The Tsimane are unique because they eat foods that have just one ingredient, which is almost certainly what most of our ancestors did for thousands of years, and predictably, this gives rise to zero heart disease, at least from the 1,000 people that were tested, which were all different ages, which is weird to test everyone at all ages because you basically never see plaque in people until after age 50, with the exception of the COVID vaccine group recently.
I live inside my own world of make-believe.
My calcium score just went from basically 20 to 800 in 6 months.
Wow.
And it's like, what the heck?
But anyways, from this research, they called the Tsimane the people with the healthiest hearts in the world, meaning they had zero plaque in their arteries, which is hard to argue with because zero plaque is zero plaque. And by the way, I think this was similarly the case with all our ancestors for thousands of years. They probably consumed single ingredient foods before mass production of grains, which messed everything up. I think all our ancestors had zero plaque in their arteries when they lived entirely off single ingredient foods, with the exception of grains or certain inflammatory diseases from parasites or infections that can damage arteries and can cause heart disease. In fact, let's contrast the Tsimane tribe, which had zero dairy, with the Maasai tribe in Kenya. So we're not cherry picking data here, which often happens when you write an entire book on one single isolated tribe. Now, the Maasai tribe is my favorite because I have a friend from the Special Forces who lived with this Maasai tribe for over a year. Shout out to Kurt if you're watching this. But scientists published a study in 1964 where they looked at 400 Maasai people, and they found little or no atherosclerosis, meaning they had zero plaque in their arteries, which is interesting because they eat almost 100% carnivore diets with loads of milk and dairy.
I live inside my own world of make-believe.
So the genetics of people are clearly shaped by how their ancestors have eaten for thousands of years, especially in the realm of dairy. The Tsimane tribe happens to have been eating a high-carb diet with plantains and sweet potatoes and such, and they also hunt for meat, and this is probably what they've been doing for ages, who knows, but it's especially likely they didn't drink milk for thousands of years. And the Maasai tribe probably has taken advantage of cow milk for thousands of years. So they are super well adapted to all those 1,000 different milk proteins and all that lactose sugar, which is a type of sugar not found in our bodies. It's sugar foreign to our bodies. In fact, we've talked about casein quite a bit. Let's talk about lactose. The problem with lactose is some people definitely have inflammation from it, and it gets worse with age because age amplifies health problems. Even if your body tries to numb you down to it, like you get numb to caffeine. If you don't have health problems, they don't amplify, but if you have health issues, they usually worsen with age. Anyway, in people that are dairy sensitive, lactose can cause nausea or bloating or diarrhea and or a bunch of other health problems, which is certainly bad news, but this is only part of the story. The other problem is sugars stick to proteins. Sugars are sticky. If you put your hand in some maple syrup, it's sticky stuff. Think, for example, about hemoglobin A1C, which is a common blood test, and how doctors are literally measuring the amount of sugar attached to your hemoglobin. How much sugar is stuck to your red blood cells. And the sugar attaches to the amino acid valine in the hemoglobin A1C, which is unusual. Most of the time when sugars stick to proteins, it occurs on the lysine amino acid or the arginine amino acid. But the main point I want you to know is sugars, including lactose, are sticky little devils, and they can attach to things. Now, a brief moment of sugar science. Lactose is technically a disaccharide, meaning it has two sugars. One is our old friend glucose, but the other sugar that is connected here is galactose. We don't need to go into the organic chemistry here, but galactose is even more sticky than glucose in terms of glycosylations, meaning galactose is more prone to sticking to proteins. Now, fructose is the most reactive for sticking to proteins, but I don't want to get too far off track here. My point is, when people are sensitive to lactose, and they often supplement a lactase pill, which is an enzyme that breaks apart the disaccharide, ultimately preventing the fermentation of lactose in your gut, this still leaves some lactose sugars that are going to be stuck to proteins. 1,000 different proteins, potentially. So it's still going to cause some low-grade gut inflammation. The sugars stuck to proteins will be hidden from enzymatic breakdown. The lactase can't access these sugars to break them down. Plus, there will always be some lactose that gets by the pill, so it's always triggering some inflammation in people with dairy issues. On a similar note, you may have heard of A1 versus A2 casein milk. A1 casein, which is what is found in most cow milk, because most modern dairy comes from the massively high-producing Holstein cows rather than Jersey or Guernsey. But this A1 milk from Holsteins releases BCM7 after it's digested, which is particularly inflammatory for people that have dairy sensitivities. So they market A2 milk as an alternative. It's a good move because BCM7 is one of the casomorphine opioids, and it's a known oxidizer of LDL, which can damage arteries. Not LDL, but oxidized LDL. And there are increased risks associated with A1 milk and type 1 diabetes because of the inflammation, heart disease from the oxidized LDL, SIDS, autism, schizophrenia, and just about anything really, because when you increase gut inflammation, you increase all chronic disease risks, whether they are directly studied or not. And in this study, they correctly note that some populations consumed A2 milk traditionally, which brings us back to the discussion of unique genetics. If you had ancestors for thousands of years that had A1 milk, I would confidently say that your body will process A1 milk just fine, no issues. But if, on the other hand, you are a person with the MCM6 gene variant, the RS code RS4988235, you can see here, you are likely to be lactose intolerant, and it gets worse with age, like I said. There are literally hundreds of studies just on this single gene variant, so it's a rabbit hole, but I'll simplify it and say this. Dairy is a problem for people with this gene. There are several other dairy sensitivity gene issues, but this is the most important one, in my opinion. And you can see here from the population incidence studies, 8.8% of people in Utah, from a Utah study, have the worst version of this gene, but 100% of the Chinese and Japanese have it. And when I do DNA consults with people from the country of India, I find MCM6 100% of the time there too. This is why they invented Ghee, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when we go over to African Americans, meaning people originally from Africa who are now living in America, about 77.2% have this bad dairy sensitivity gene. And 50% of people with Mexican ancestry that reside in Los Angeles have this bad dairy intolerance gene. And 83.3% of people from Italy. So you can see it's a widely variable. Now, if you have the worst version of these dairy sensitivity genes, I think it's imperative that you avoid dairy. Avoid all dairy. Dairy is a great protein source. Get your protein from somewhere else. Dairy is a great calcium source. Get your calcium from somewhere else. Dairy is a great source of morphine. Get your morphine from somewhere else. This study from 2016 was an assessment of the totality of scientific evidence on milk and dairy, and they say that the totality of evidence supports the intake of milk and dairy, and it may protect against the most prevalent chronic diseases. It may. And they focus on a higher protein, which improves body composition, muscle benefits for sure, bone benefits for sure, but here's the thing. When you go to the conflicts of interest and funding section, it's massive. And these authors are being paid by dairy industry funding. Without a doubt, they're going to spin dairy in a positive light and they'll ignore the negative aspects. And dairy is a positive thing for some people. The problem is you can't lump everyone in that group because for some people it's literally inflammatory. And I think it's inflammatory if it's raw, if it's pasteurized, if it's fermented, even butter, sour cream, yogurt. If you have extreme dairy sensitivity genes, you're sensitive to the sugars and the proteins. From my experience of 15 years of doing DNA consulting, when people have bad dairy genes and they remove dairy 100%, it's far better for their health outcomes. And we'll talk about raw dairy here in a minute. But remember, even if you take a lactase pill, you're still getting mucin secretion, mucus, from the casein and probably dozens of other proteins that aren't well studied amidst the 1,000 dairy proteins that your ancestors were never exposed to. And some of the lactose is sneaking by on these proteins and triggering gut inflammation. And even butter has casein, and even fermented dairy products have casein. They don't have as much, but it doesn't take much to trigger low-grade chronic inflammation. And raw milk has casein, in case you wonder. The only cow dairy product that I think is acceptable for someone with bad dairy genes is clarified butter, also known as ghee. And I don't think you should buy ghee at the store. It's massively overpriced, unless you're Jeff Bezos watching this. I think you should watch a few YouTube videos and make it at home. Make ghee at home. You basically just melt butter in a pot. You skim off the white stuff that comes to the surface. That white stuff is the dairy proteins. And then you let the butter re-solidify, and then you're good to go. Cut it into chunks, freeze it. So you only need to do this a few times per year. But that's the only acceptable dairy product for people with the bad MCM6 gene variant, in my opinion. We have an epidemic of chronic inflammation, and we all need to be extreme about all the additive sources of inflammation. And by the way, the fats in dairy are excellent. I want you to have ghee. Go out of your way to have ghee because the fats are excellent for you. Butter has butyrate, which is literally named butyrate from the Latin word for butter. And butyrate is a fat that we could talk for hours about. It influences your gut-brain axis, which improves your serotonin, because 95% of our serotonin is produced in the gut. And butyrate inhibits high glucose-induced inflammation. And on and on and on. We could talk for hours, again, about butyrate, but butter, it also has lots of various fat-soluble vitamins. Especially important is vitamin K2, which has almost disappeared from the modern diet because people aren't eating fermented foods. But the point is, clarified butter, also known as ghee, is not inflammatory, so I encourage it for everyone, even if you have a dairy sensitivity. It was invented in India because so many people have dairy issues there, probably from worshiping cows in ancient times, but I don't know. But have ghee and lots of it. Now, for non-cow milk products like goat milk, goat cheese, sheep cheese, there are no genes linked to issues with these foods. You should be good, but here's what I suggest. Take a full month off of all the dairy products and then go to the store, buy goat milk, even if you don't like the milk and you just like the cheese, buy the milk and drink a large glass. If you have zero adverse effects from a blast of goat milk, and you should have zero adverse effects, you're good to go with goat yogurt, goat milk, and similar alternative products. Most people that have cow dairy sensitivities can have goat or sheep products all day long. I recommend it because it is indeed an excellent source of various bone minerals and muscle building proteins. The dairy industry isn't wrong about those benefits, even though they're biased against the problems and the group of people that have the problems. But let's talk about raw milk and close on it. I usually don't talk about my personal diet and habits because my genes are different than your genes, so I don't want people doing what I do when it may not work for them. But I have pristine dairy genes, meaning my ancestors were raising A1 cows and enjoying cow dairy probably for ages. I can take a month off. I've done this exact experiment. I can take a month off and then I go to the grocery store, buy a regular carton of pasteurized milk and have 3 large glasses and I feel amazing. But I'll tell you what I do here. I literally go to a farm every week. It's the Fonders farm. And he has a huge stainless steel tank, taller than me, in a cold room, and he pushes a button which mixes the milk, and I hold glass jars while he opens the faucet and fills them. Really, it's my wife that does this most of the time, but we have 5 kids, and that's how we do dairy. No plastic jars, no ultra-pasteurized, unnatural nonsense. I'm absolutely a fan of raw milk compared to pasteurized milk, and I'm especially grateful for the Weston A. Price Foundation for basically getting raw milk legalized in all the states where it was once basically illegal in all the states. Check out the Weston A. Price Foundation website page, Facts About Raw Milk, if you want more information about deaths and risks versus benefits of raw milk. They even have a group on Facebook. You can find your local raw milk dealers. Just shoot them a message. I wouldn't trust the propaganda arm on this one, because most of the propaganda about the dangers of raw milk arose when people thought germs were bad. Meaning there was a time when people didn't realize we have an estimated 100 trillion gut bacteria literally thriving inside our bodies. And that doesn't even account for the skin biome and things like that. And we don't need to kill everything in sight to make it edible, including raw milk. But read both sides of the argument for yourself. What is truly maddening here is when the government goes after farmers who dare to produce food that isn't approved by their expensive and unnecessary bullshit process, which obviously doesn't work. Look at the rising rates of disease in America. And they'll go after Amos Miller in Pennsylvania and literally destroy his food products. This is an actual picture of his horrendous farm, which is such an abomination to our society, according to the government. They can't seem to search and lock up people for the massive Doge frauds that were uncovered in the federal government, but they'll go after these raw dairy farmers. So support your local food producers and cut out the middleman. But the other thing is, boiling the living shit out of your dairy is just not logical. Heat increases glycosylation, meaning more sugars get stuck to the dairy proteins, meaning it's going to create more inflammation. The proteins are also going to denature and refold in some weird, unnatural configurations that our ancestors were never exposed to. So now it doesn't matter what tribe of ancestors you came from or what your genes are, you're now ingesting frankenfood, which is just basic biology mixed with common sense that says, this is wrong. Real food is not supposed to be shelf stable for 1,000 years, and you aren't supposed to denature everything before you eat or drink it. Dairy is no exception. And there are studies showing heating milk lowers the nutrient content. But even if they hadn't done the studies, knowing what I know as a professional, I'd go with raw milk over pasteurized milk 100% of the time, assuming it's harvested in a clean facility with basic sanitary measures that are all seen as basic things these days. You know, in the late 19th century, raw milk was tested as an IV fluid in the USA because it was so similar to human blood. Even in 1854, Canadian physicians, James Bovell and Edwin Hodder, tried milk transfusions with mixed results. And they probably used a dirty needle and non-sterilized infusion bags and milk that had been transported across a street filled with horse feces. I think we have better alternatives today for IVs, but I'm just saying, I definitely would go with raw milk infusions over pasteurized milk infusions if I had to choose. The pasteurized product would probably trigger legit anaphylactic shock, even with completely sterile IV equipment, and the raw milk clearly doesn't do that. And there are some studies on the problems with pasteurizing milk, but imagine trying to get any funding to do those studies. These are probably cowboy researchers. They're all 1 week away from retiring, so they don't need future funding from the government, things like that. But anyway, they find denatured proteins, denatured from heating, something that obviously will occur, like I said earlier. The pasteurized milk loses antimicrobial and immune modulating properties. And in a different study, loss of bactericidal proteins diminishes in milk, diminishes milk's ability to fight pathogens in the infant gut, meaning raw dairy fights bad bacteria, but pasteurizing ruins that superpower. And they find altered protein structures, again, from pasteurization. That may heighten allergic responses, which again is basic biology. Nothing mind-blowing here. So long story short, I personally go with raw dairy, and I see arguments from both sides in a modern mass production grocery system. But raw dairy is the clear winner in my professional opinion for personal use. And regarding the vegans that love to hate dairy, I can see your perspective because you probably went vegan and then you felt significantly better. It was noticeable. And so you decided everyone should go vegan because it works so well for you, and you're shocked that people just won't go along with your diet. The problem is, it was very unlikely that the unprocessed meat was the real problem. It was almost certainly the dairy, and now you feel better without the dairy. I'm on board with avoiding dairy for you, So keep up the good work there. The yogurts, the sour cream, the daily cheese, even the butter. Remember, use ghee. So yes, I understand where the vegans are coming from here, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And you especially shouldn't throw out someone else's baby because of your baby's bathwater, because everyone has different bathwater that needs to be discarded. Yours just happens to be dairy because your ancestors didn't raise cows.